Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen.
All right.
The wakelets, they're very, very good. I really like them.
The which, sorry?
Your concept, the Kelton wakelets, the links to, the suggestion you made about for the new liberals.
Oh, I'm having a bit of a brain gap here. So
I gathered, using your wakelet strategy, the indexed articles to back up another article.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That's even a little bit about what Scott had been working on years ago. He'd worked on some of the first, hyperlinks. And I remember reading good old George Steiner, and this, he's one of my favorite Meridians as an author. I don't know if you heard of him, but he passed away a couple years ago, and he was a critic, like a literary critic. So he wrote a book on Martin Heidegger, and he's very well read and a little bit of a hoity-toity, but I just love I love his writing and his love for academics, basically classical literature, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I think we all kind of return to some books from time to time. Do you have any of those kinds of books or favorite authors that you kind of go back to over a period of time?
I wish I had time. I'm just overwhelmed by the workload I've got these days. So I read what's appropriate for what I'm working on, which almost always means journal articles these days. My favorite author from economics in many ways is John Blatt, who was a mathematician who got exposed to neoclassical economics. Have I told this tale to you before? I'm not sure.
No. Okay. But I mean, with my memory, well, we got two options here, Steve, right? Because remember, we say we can keep repeating the stuff, right? Because people tune in, to whatever episode, right?
Okay. Well, my approach is quite mathematical to economics. A lot of critics say mathematics is the problem. I said mathematics was abused by neoclassical economists. It was never done properly by them. And that's been a cover. And in fact, the way to pull them apart is to use decent mathematics. That came out of my having done mathematics at university when I was also doing economics. And then at a later point, back to say 1971, when I was doing undergraduate mathematics and thinking what economists call mathematics is shit. They have no idea how to do mathematical modeling properly. Anyway, when I came back to do my master's and then Ph.D., I'd heard of this guy called John Blatt, and he was a professor of applied mathematics. He established the mathematics department at the University of New South Wales. Before that, he was involved in working on the world's third computer ever called Celiac. And this was something which was built in Sydney University. And the reason he was in Sydney University was he and his father were refugees from the pogroms in Europe, from Austria in their case, went to America and didn't like the politics. This is back in the McCarthyist days. And that's when they moved to Australia. So this guy's got an Austrian, American, Australian background. And he was a notoriously difficult person to work with. Very capable of telling you your idea is nonsense. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics twice in the 1950s. Didn't get it, but was nominated. Another guy who was nominated for the Nobel Prize in economics, in this case, was at New South University as well. And this is called Murray Kemp. And Murray's actually a lovely man. I used to play tennis with him. He used to beat me all the time. Lovely human being. He died just recently. He was a major builder of neoclassical models of free trade, which I'm a critic of course. But I have immense respect for him as a human being. Anyway, Murray decided one day that his only true peer at New South Wales University was John Blatt, because they'd both been nominated for a Nobel Prize. So he invited John to attend a seminar. And John sat through the seminar, and at the end of it, Murray, I wasn't there. This was a repeated story to me by people who were there, including my own Ph.D. supervisor. But when the seminar finished, Murray just looked over the heads of the rest of the audience and asked John what he thought. And John had a heavy Austrian accent, and he replied, "This is the greatest load of rubbish I have sat through in decades. If this is advanced economics, there's something seriously wrong with economics, and I intend finding out what it is."
Telling it like, yeah.
Down like a lead balloon, but he actually he wanted a Led Zeppelin to fall on top of Murray, and Murray didn't change Murray's approach to economics one jot, as it happens. But anyway, so Black, true to his word, you need to show the thoroughness of the man. He didn't just go and read an economics textbook. He went back and read every major work from Controll forward. And his final decision was the greatest economist of all time was Francois Quenet. Okay, the last of the physiocrats, the one who developed the Tableau Économique. And so he went right through the classical school and the neoclassical and all the equilibrium analysis they do and how flawed it is. It was a truly brilliant book. So that's one that I return to whenever I can. And one thing I'm pleased to say, that it's now available again. It was actually out of print for a long, long time, and it's now been reproduced very, very well in an electronic version. So I've now got a copy of that. So that's one I return to when I can. I go back to Schumpeter when I have a chance. I read some of Keynes's papers. I don't particularly like the general theory. I go back and read Marx, but it's ages since I've had a chance to read Marx. I read everything Marx ever wrote in economics between 1844 and I think you can pretty much date it 1867, because he wrote the last volumes of Capital were his unedited notes for the first volume of Capital, as it happens. So yeah, I return to books when I can, but the trouble is these days I'm so damn busy, I just don't get a chance to go back and read for pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was that first book that you mentioned with the guy who yelled over the people's heads?
It's called Dynamic Economic Systems, a post-Keynesian approach, by John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T. And you can, if you just search for his name and then the book, you'll find a link to buy it in the electronic version. Highly worthwhile.
Good.
Okay, well, that was a really nice story, and that's I find that Steve does a lot of nice, generous drops of references in our shows, right? If you think back, Steve, you do mention things. It's our job to put them on and make it easier for people to find. What I want to throw an idea your way, because I would love to try and amp the show up a little bit, and we've kind of been talking about it, but I don't want to inundate you with a proposal. I think it's actually better that the three of us kind of talk about it. So do you think it would be too much to try and get Stephanie Kelton in a live show?
Oh, no, Stephanie, well, she's working her butt off as usual, but she's a good friend, so I can drop her a note and say, would you have time for a podcast? So, yeah.
Well, my proposal would be something similar to the way we have, except for I'd like to see a live show, and I'd like to have a little bit of a different theme, because we want it to, be advantageous for her as well. And I think, it might even be worthwhile for us to kind of up the ante and do something a little bit higher production, a little bit more focused, something that, kind of cuts through the noise. And, just to get the ball rolling on an idea is that I'm coming into the post Keynesian world, and also MMT, as somebody with very new to these concepts, and as somebody that's new coming into the concept of MMT, I kind of look at it this way, and I go, correct me if I'm wrong here, right? But we're sitting on a huge untapped resource of finance with an asterisk beside it, okay? So it does feel like it comes with a lot of responsibility, especially if we leverage MMT to some of its full potential. But it seems to me that we have a potential to do some pretty unique and creative things with the creation of money. And what I would like the show to be is some examples of that, right? Like, say, for example, we refunded, defunded, reorganized anything from, defense budgets to, manufacturing sector, or, the arts, humanities, for example. Incentivizing people to do non-GDP produced, final goods, does what? Does this elevate inflation, which is the anathema according to MMT, right? So it's like, wait a minute, there's an ability to provide an abundance of revenue, of money, of buying potential and capital, into the markets. For what purpose, right? And does, one particular example, what would we have to guard against in terms of inflation? These types of things. That was the idea. And I don't know if that's, but we'd have to kind of think about each episode and give a particular scenario. But I think the reason why I was pushing for that is that the policymakers can actually think, oh yeah, that's okay. Here's an example of how we can, because I'm telling you, our politicians are kind of like dead weight. They just don't even get it.
Yeah. I mean, worse than dead weight. Yeah. And I'm watching Australia's Prime Minister at the moment make a fool of himself by saying he's saving money by not funding hospitals to fight COVID. Well, that's really good. Yeah. Insane ideas of what is the role of government, in that case, to stop spending when its real role is to spend sensibly. So, but it's a bit difficult to do that. I mean, what you want to do is say, well, what are some of the methods by which you could have government funding in a way that didn't annoy, people who believe the government shouldn't try to pick winners. And that's really the, you need things which mean the government isn't trying to do what the market does.
I agree with that in a big way. Yeah. A big way. I really do.
So for example, there are some things the government should manufacture. I mean, or at least pay for the building of, and pay fixed price rather than endless pockets, which is what they've done with the space race, for example, which is why the ULA scheme and so much what NASA's been doing is going nowhere. That's a real sign of badly funded government activity. But you want to find things where you say, well, you don't want a bureaucrat deciding what car to build and what car to buy and et cetera, but you do want them giving money for students and say, okay, here's money to survive as a student. Top class education, it's difficult to get in. The barrier is not money, it's intelligence and low capacity to learn. But we're going to fund you so you can do it, and you spend the money and that goes into the community. And in that case, you're not trying to, the government's not directing who spends on what. It's saying we need education, we're going to fund it well. And then, so that sort of thing is something I think the government should be providing. And you can make a strong case for that. When it comes to other things like, today, these days, like not 50 years ago, but these days, should the government be attempting to build rockets for space exploration? Apparently not. Okay, and then you've got to say, well, there's been technological developments where if the government hadn't put all that money in back in the 60s, we wouldn't have the skill basis that enabled modern entrepreneurs to do what they're doing. But modern entrepreneurs have gone so far past the limitations of the government system that it's better to say the government simply should be funding them, but not trying to build it themselves. And the way they fund it, I mean, you look at the open-ended funding Boeing is getting, and the fast that's led to. So it's a complicated story. It's not a straightforward one about how the government should spend the money. But the fundamental point, and this is the one you have to start from, is the government should be creating money for the rest of us to use, which is fundamentally for the recipients of that money, it's debt-free. So you have a form of money which is not based on personal debt.
Yeah,
and that's the point I want to get across.
Well, you've talked about this Jubilee before, right? And that's something how would you envision the Jubilee actually rolling out, like the removal of debts, or people that don't know that?
Well, I've actually done a large set of Minsky models on that, and I've got to revise them to some extent because I had the government. I have people who received the money and didn't have debt buying corporate shares, but it's been pointed out to me recently that corporations at the moment are obsessed with, leverage, not just leverage buyouts, but also share buybacks. So it may be very hard to get the corporate sector to issue those shares. So maybe you should use it for another form of asset market. But I have done a model of how Jubilee would work. And it's fundamentally that the government can simply issue money to people and back that money by bonds. Okay, so exactly this. At the moment, the government spends, when the government gives a welfare check, it doesn't give a debt to the welfare recipient for that. Okay, mm-hmm. It runs its own personal deficit. The government runs its deficit, and that creates a surplus for the welfare recipient. That sort of thing. And I've done the mechanics to how that could be done. So it is quite straightforward. It's just like an expanded version of typical government funding right now. But then what you'd be using it to do is say, well, as a recipient of this money, if you have debt, you must pay your debt down. If you don't have debt, then you don't want to. If an old-fashioned debt jubilee would just benefit those who'd borrowed money. Okay, so people who said, I'm not going to involve in the household speculation, I'm going to rent, would lose out. Okay? So the idea of the modern debt jubilee is everybody gets the same amount of money. Mm. Those who are in debt must pay their debt down. Those who don't get a cash injection, which is it doesn't discriminate whether you were or were not somebody who borrowed money to gamble on rising house prices. That's the way to do it that way. Once you've done it that way, if you think about dividing society into three classes: those who own their houses outright, okay? Those who have a mortgage, and those who rent. Okay. Now, if you get an income, you mentioned the ones who own their houses outright are more likely to be wealthy. Okay, the ones in the mortgages wealthier than those who rent. The ones that rent more numerous than the other two. So when you do the cash injection, because there are more people who are renting than who own their houses outright, it's actually it's a wealth redistribution as well. Not in absolute terms. Okay, yeah. Everybody gets an increase in their nominal wealth, but more of that goes to people who are poor than are rich. So it reverses what's happened with quantitative easing, where more's gone to people who are rich than are poor, because QE was designed to boost the price of shares. It succeeded in doing that, which has made people who own shares much wealthier. Well, that's great for the people who own shares, and they're the 1%. So we've actually had government policies that have actually increased the inequality of the capitalist system. So I want to reverse that, and modern debt jubilee would do that.
All right.
Yeah, let me just add that. It was just today that I had a conversation about how this whole fantasy that the ruling class doesn't like big government began with Reagan in the U.S. with his joke that when someone knocks on the door and says, "I'm
from the government, I'm here to help." Yeah,
that's the last thing that you want to hear, right, Nancy?
Yeah.
Isn't that the worst? So, but actually, they've created the ruling class pipeline inside the government where it's just being funneled into whatever they want to do.
Mm.
So it's not the case that they want a small government. In fact, the larger the government for them, the better, as long as it's moving money in the right direction.
Yeah, and the problem, the weakness people tackle onto with modern monetary theory in terms of ideological weakness is that the desire you don't want the government getting in your way. But what's going on there is people are thinking about the government as taxing and regulating, not thinking about the government as also spending. And having an attitude to spending that says spending must be creating a debt for me, the future, not for the government. Well, you take a look at it, and that simply isn't true. First of all, a government that spends more than it taxes is putting more money in than it's taking out. Okay, and secondly, the government when it is spending, I mean, that is actually increasing the revenue flow and the profits of the private sector. So there's an enormous amount of confusion there, and the thing which people, I've got the same resistance. I don't want a bureaucrat telling me what to do. Okay, now I do want bureaucrats putting up rules that mean you have a well-structured society. But like for example, when I was in education, the extent to which we had to jump through hoops set up by education bureaucrats was incredibly frustrating, because it was, as somebody on the ground actually doing the teaching, I knew what a joke this stuff was, but I had to go along with the joke. So you don't, that's the sort of intrusion that people don't want to see. But I'd rather say, well, fund education very well, give the academics the power to run the universities, give the students the spending power, and then therefore you've got the decisions about how to run the universities being done by those who actually do the work in the universities, not the bloody vice chancellors and the bureaucrats below them, but the academics, and you let the students do the spending.
That's a good free market idea.
And lo and behold, you know what Steve went out and did? He got himself involved with politics, so he's going to be a bureaucrat, right? That's the ultimate.
No, politician. Maybe. Unfortunately, politician, not a bureaucrat.
But the thing that you just said about the government, that these programs actually help the private sector, isn't that the whole Keynesian idea? Is that you give the workers enough money so that they can buy the stuff they're making, so they can complete the circuit all the way to consumption? To
some extent, yeah. I mean, the thing about what people get confused about with money and profits, and money is a stock and profits are a flow. So money is dollars and profits are dollars per year. And that leads to a lot of confusion as well. But when you look at in terms of profits, you see that a government deficit actually boosts profits. And if a government deficit causes a high level of employment, then it can boost wages as well. So you don't get a negative relationship between what the government does and the private sector. You get a positive reinforcing effect between the two. And the important issue is not to let that overwhelm the productive capabilities of the economy. And that's the thing where MMT talks about the worry about inflation. Another issue as well is innovation. You want this to actually be generating innovation rather than preventing it. And if you look at what happened with the Soviet Union, a lot of the ways about how the Soviet Union were organized industrially meant that the central planning approach suppressed innovation. And part of that was because there was such a level of demand relative to, the monetary demand was far higher than the capacity to supply goods. Okay, you don't want that outcome coming out of MMT. So you've got to say, how do you set things up that you still get the excess physical capacity that is a characteristic of capitalism with a high level of aggregate demand? Mm-hmm. So there are definitely some, complicated, curly parts to what it involves to take MMT seriously that we haven't yet got into the literature.
And that's something we covered undergrad. The discrepancy between the Soviet lack of innovation and then the American super innovation. And the idea was that that's just what happens whenever you have a command economy. They step in there and then suddenly there's no incentive. So the government pretends to pay you, the workers pretend to work, no one's really doing anything. And so what's the truth behind that? And what in particular created the massive discrepancy between Soviet and American industrial innovation?
Well, it's a very genuine point. That's the one I'm not going to dismiss. And I went to Cuba a few years ago and I saw the phenomenon in operation as well. And if you look at what is actually involved in that, the best work's done by a guy called Janos Kornai, the Kornai. And Kornai is a Hungarian economist who was mystified by the same thing. Why is the rate of innovation so slow in Eastern Europe and so fast comparatively in America and Western Europe? And he developed the idea of a stylized socialist economy versus a stylized capitalist one. So leave Stalin out of the picture. You can obviously blame Stalin for a lot of things, but say there's something about the nature of a command economy that led to this outcome of low innovation. He said, well, if you have a genuine socialist economy, it's one dedicated to the maximum possible income of the maximum number of people. It's not supposed to be about the elite. It's getting everybody what they need. And you also, because you started with an undeveloped economy, then you have a desire to expand production everywhere. And therefore, when you do your 5-year plan, you don't have sufficient physical resources to fulfill the needs for investment goods for all the various sectors of the economy. So everybody gets slightly less than they asked for. which means, therefore, that you have a shortage of supply. And also because things never work perfectly, what actually will arrive will be less again than what you need. So there'll be ways in which the physical, you'll be given less inputs than you need to produce the outputs you're required to produce by the plan. So the sensible response to that as a manager is not to innovate. Why waste money trying to change the motorbike when you know you can't produce enough of the motorbikes given the current supplies you have anyway? So what you get is, forget innovation, that goes out the window. You just produce as many goods as you can, which will be less than you're required to by the plan. And so what you get is no technological change, okay? No change in the product base itself, but everybody's fully employed. But you have to queue to buy goods rather than having the prices going up, rather than getting that sort of inflation. You get queuing. Can I tell a bad Jewish joke here?
Absolutely.
Okay. There's a village in centrally planned Russian days, and the local commissar comes and says, there is meat in the butcher shop today. Please line up for the butcher shop. The village lines up to the butcher shop. Commissar comes out an hour later. There's not enough meat for everybody. The Jews will have to leave. So the Jewish people walk off. And then he comes out, there's not enough food for everybody. The men under 65 will have to leave, except for the war veterans. And so they leave. There's not enough for everybody. The women and children will have to leave. And finally, get down to the end, there's only a couple of old, over 65 war veterans standing in the line. And if I says, there is no meat, you'll all have to go home. And one veteran turns to the other and says, the Jews always get the best deal.
Oh, my God.
But anyway, I mean, incredible shortages and queuing was the outcome. And now saw
but you're talking about shortages of inputs to production, right?
And therefore shortages of outputs as well. And therefore people get paid more money than they can actually use. So when you buy a television set, I actually know, I literally personally know an example, one of my ex-girlfriends. Okay. She paid for a television set and delivery date was going to be 10 years after. So she managed to wrangle being on a delegation to America and bought a color TV set for herself and brought it back home 9 years before she would have got the black and white provided by okay. So you really got that to be that bad. And that's where the classic joke comes up. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, which of course makes it work even less effectively. They said the reason capitalism succeeds in taking a stylized capitalist economy at the other extreme, you're trying to get a maximum profit for the minimum group. It's all about the elite. Screw the workers. And you got lots of, this is the other thing, lots of firms competing for the available demand. Now, when you're competing for a limited base of demand, it's not price competition that rules capitalism. It's quality competition, product diversification. So you try to come out with a product that's different to what your competitors have and better in ways that the market will appreciate. So you've got to innovate to be able to get hold of the small amount of demand that actually exists. But in doing that, you also have to have excess capacity. If you don't have excess capacity and you actually do have the successful product, you can't sell it. I
see. So you're linking the qualitative result coming from having a research and development department with the quantitative effect of having enough inputs to produce.
Not just that, it's also about you're not trying to give everybody a car. You're trying to sell cars to the ones who can afford it. Okay, so it's not like a relief if you get everybody a vehicle and therefore you've got a demand like in Russia for 350 million cars. Which you can't fulfill it, so then you start getting rationing, and then the queuing effect. And you produce traverse made of cardboard, to make up for the insufficiency of metal inputs into production, all that sort of stuff. Now you're trying to produce a high quality car for a small market, and therefore you fight by innovation, and you have lots of excess capacity. So that means you get the West doesn't grow as doesn't produce the same volume, but it has booms and slumps, but it innovates. And Cornet's point was, well, you actually want to get the best of both worlds. You want to have the provision for the majority while enabling innovation to occur at the same time. And And that involves partially, firms competing with each other, which is what the Hungarians, to some extent, and the Yugoslavians had under their versions of Soviet socialism. But when you have the single provider and everybody has to queue and your wages are insufficient, blah, 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 you get that classic effect. We pretend to work, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. And when I went to Cuba, one thing I had a day where my meetings were cancelled. And so I thought I might go to the beach and check out the beach. And I went to the tourist section of the hotel I was in. And there were 3 women at 3 different desks there. And I just stood there waiting until one of them would make eye contact with me. And they managed to avoid making eye contact for over half an hour. Just working in the paperwork.
You should have filmed that experiment since it cost you so much emotional energy to stand there.
So I then walked up to one of them and said, I'd like to go and check out the beach. Said, go and ask one of the taxi drivers outside to drive you down there. In other words, there being such shit wages, just filling time.
Well, they fulfilled the new function, which is the anti-help desk.
Yeah, anti-help desk. So that is a true problem with the socialist system and with the excess aggregate demand. Now, you could potentially use MMT, the knowledge of MMT, to produce substantial demand in the economy such that you guaranteed full employment. Okay. Now, would that then lead to cost pressures because you have rising wages? Would it lead to shortages? Not necessarily shortages because you have competitive firms trying to get the maximum market share they can. There's still the desire for the individual firms to innovate, to take out their rivals. But you do have that potential danger that, if you have full employment, then you potentially have a bargaining ploy for the workers to demand wage rises. And when you see inflation as the effect of a struggle over the distribution of income, then you could cause that outcome. And so therefore you have to say, well, you can't just be a policy about generating government money. It's got to also be something about how you negotiate with the labour movement to minimise the competitive pressures, the class competitive pressures over the distribution of income to make sure you don't get an inflationary spiral taking place.
So you said something very interesting about inflation, that it was like the stagnation of money flow. I think if I understood that correctly, like the flow of the flow of money being I guess interrupted. Did you say something like that about when? No.
The point about inflation is that it's really when you look at what determines the costs of capitalists, okay, it's as a class, a social class. It's fundamentally the matter they've got to pay to other people outside that class, and the two fundamental elements of that are workers, but also raw material providers. Now, if you have a high level of aggregate demand, as we had back in the 60s and early 70s, then that can mean you have low unemployment, which means workers have got bargaining power, and they can demand wage rises, and that can cause a wage price spiral. And you also have raw material producers, where raw materials aren't subject to the same rules of production as a factory is. So a factory normally has excess capacity and declining marginal costs over time. So you have constant or falling marginal costs as you increase output, which is advantageous to the firms and means actually a higher level of output can mean a lower level of prices, right? Because you have the capacity to do that. When you look at raw materials, not the same story. If you want to pump out oil more quickly, you've got to add to your if you actually having to push the oil out of the soil these days rather than letting it bubble out in the old days, then you have to add the pressure. You've got to increase your energy input, and you have past a certain point you do get capacity constraints. There's only a certain amount you can get out of a well. You've got to drill more wells if you want to get more output out. All that sort of stuff means that there's more of a supply cost driven price effect to raw materials. And we had that back in the 70s with OPEC twice. So those are the sort of things that give you an inflationary surge. But you've got to be aware of those income distribution issues if you're going to try to run an economy at full employment while avoiding a debilitating inflationary spiral, which is really a struggle between workers and capitalists over the distribution of income.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to grab onto, was that linkage between the workers and the organizations. Okay, earlier you mentioned something about the modern Jubilee, right? And in that scenario, everybody was given a kind of like a lump sum, whatever that ends up being, right, to kind of clear off debt. And so, I'm just curious, what do you think? It's an it's a inflationary pressure that the rich class would have so much more disposable income? Would they, drive prices up, and inflation, would there be an inflationary pressure from the surplus of capital for wealthy? Yeah.
From the Jubilee? No, that's opposite. If you think about, I've done one little model where I had workers and capitalists, workers, bankers, and capitalists, effectively. And because there's, workers are 90 to 95% of the population and capitalists are 5%, then 95% of the Jubilee money goes to workers and 5% to capitalists.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So what you get is a dramatic reduction in wealth inequality, not by taking wealth off the poor, off the rich, but by giving the same amount to everybody, which has far more impact upon the wealth levels of the poor than it has upon the rich.
That's brilliant. Well, it really is. Years ago, somebody asked me if I won a lottery, how would I spend the money? And I had this egalitarian sort of thing in my head. I said, I just split it equally, because, for the rest of my life, I would hear from, people in the family that said I never gave enough to that one, or someone did. I said, well, screw it. I just take it and divide it, 100 ways and say there's no more money. Right? Like, these big lotteries where you've got $100 million or something, I'd be fine with $100,000. What does that do for all of your whole family, to partially pay off a home, and, it could really, really provide a nice distributed sort of thing. And I always thought, even people around me would say, wow, that's noble. You could actually share that 100 ways. And I was like, why is that so difficult? Like, what is it about our nature that makes that so difficult? Because someone will say, well, I would do this, I do that, I blah, blah, blah. It's just a weird phenomenon, how we kind of hoard money.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've made it the reward system for our society. So, and like the rewards of having that wealth are, enormous. I mean, when you see some of the ludicrous toys that the rich have bought themselves with the wealth they've got these days, super yachts, mansions for their pets, et cetera, et cetera. There's simply absurd stuff that comes out of this concentration of wealth. But it's, when you have that level of wealth, it's very seductive, because it means, as I remember, I think it was in the guy who a book called The Ebony Tower. John, I can't think of John's last name, but the book called The Ebony Tower. And he has a character who's a butterfly collector who actually wins a lottery and is obsessed with a particular woman. So he tries to capture her using the revenue he's got from the lottery. And at one point, having gone from having no money to lots of money, this character says, with money, there are no barriers. And that's the seductive thing for that level of wealth. Whatever you want to do, you can do. Now, we've always had hierarchies in our societies, but what capitalism gives us is a sort of distributed hierarchy, not just one person at the top. Then it could be dozens who've accumulated that much wealth. But once they've got that level of wealth, the freedom that gives them is something that they're not about to give up voluntarily, and that is partly the reason you see tax evasion, all the struggles to dominate the system. They don't want they've got real freedom. They don't want it taken away.
Yeah.
Speaking of motivation, so what do you say to people when you're discussing a universal basic income and they say, well, actually, it'd be better, and I think Keynes maybe said something like this, you can't just give people money directly. You have to bury it in the ground and then pay them to dig it out with shovels. And at least that way you get them out of their houses, because you don't want to train them and condition them to be rewarded for sitting at home watching TV, playing with themselves, having babies, doing nothing. So you need to get something to force them, even if it's just pretend nothing, busy work. It has to be. There must be some suffering in there. Otherwise, it's wrong and it creates bad humans.
Yeah, the funny thing is neoclassical economics effectively assumes we're all starting from that situation anyway. But what they argue is that work is a disutility and leisure is a utility. And if you're not paid enough, you'll forget about doing your work and just enjoy leisure. Now, the only way you can enjoy leisure in the real sense is if you have an income that's independent of you having to work. So in a ridiculous way, the neoclassicals start assuming we could all decide not to work because we've got another source of self-sufficiency. That means we've got to be enticed by a wage to come out and work, something we wouldn't otherwise do. So their starting point is to assume that's where we are. Now, the reality is we're not. If you don't get a job in a capitalist system without welfare, you starve to death. So there's no such thing as leisure when you're starving. That is the weakness in how the neoclassicals think about it. Like in terms of a universal, when you think about a properly developed human society, not the monstrosities we have today, but go back to our Cro-Magnon roots, we lived in communities, and a large part of your status in that community is what your contribution was to it. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, you weren't, when we look at those societies, they tended to be gift societies. People would do what they could, which was special, and gift what they made to other people, expecting, of course, gifts back. So it's a gift-based society is what we came from. And that's what I'd like. If you wanted to reproduce the best of human culture, and you want to get back to the stages where you do what you do to make a contribution to a community you're part of.
Yeah.
Now, that's feasible with a universal basic income. If people then said, okay, I feel like I'm receiving this on behalf of my own community, and I'm going to do stuff for my community, whether that's, painting or, doing nature reclamation, et cetera, et cetera. But we've forgotten just how far we've removed ourselves from the foundations of human society to live in the types of societies we do these days, where you don't even know who your neighbours are half the time, or 90% of the time. So if we had societies designed on the basis of the types of societies we used to live in, you'd have about 150 neighbours. You'd know all of them. You'd be interacting with them, and their regard for you was be a major determinant of your own behaviour. Now, and that would be the ultimate world for a UBI. I mean, I'll give you another anecdote, which I think was quite remarkable. Yeah, sorry.
I have something to add on to that I think is kind of opposite to you, or something to maybe think about.
Yeah,
it's a technocrat. It's like the rise of the technocrat, right? So it's this or it's an advocate for the technocratic society or technology-based society. Okay, so if I make the claim that even the three people in this virtual room together, although we're not in a physical proximity, and we may have beamed into our little pods in Taiwan and in Vancouver and Houston, but the alignment and the synergy that happens between our three minds was only brought to us because of the technology our isolation. So think of it as like the neural network just raised up one other level of
completely
evolution sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you into just parody what I was talking about a while ago. One of the reasons I couldn't stand the university bureaucrats was they tried to make the department become a specialist in a particular area. Whereas, when I'm working with my economics, the main people I work with were an electronic engineer halfway up the coast of Norway, a mathematician in Toronto, a Jesuit priest in France. So there's that sort of regional, local base has been transformed by what we've got with the internet these days, and I wouldn't want to lose that. Absolutely. But I'm saying for the vast majority of people, if you're working in a 9-to-5 job, or these days is 8 to 6, 8 to 7 job, and you come back to a community where you don't know anybody, et cetera, it's in that sort of world, if you gave a universal basic income, yes, you could lie around in your ass doing nothing, which could be a negative. But like at some extent, we want, with global warming, we'll want people lying in their asses doing nothing because
exactly,
so there's all the mess we've created for ourselves is so enormous. But if I wanted to imagine a future society where we've gone through, survive what we're going to do with climate change and come up with a society on the other side, then this sounds space cadet, but I'm going to stick with it anyway. In that world, we would be doing most of our production offshore, off planet.
Off planet, yeah.
Okay, and then the whole idea of working would be something we'd have to redefine, because to work you need to be in outer space. The vast majority of the productive capability of our civilization. So at some point, we've got to confront that hassle between giving income on the basis of work and giving income on the basis of being a human being. And, I'm not particularly fond of the debate at either extreme that I see at the moment, because a lot of the advocates for a job guarantee are trashing the idea of universal basic income.
And I like your point. The reason I asked the question that way is because most people, when I argue this with them, they use the human nature argument, but they leave the fact out that the human nature has been artificially engineered. We've become antisocial. So of course, antisocial people are going to act like selfish jerks. But I mean, imagine if you have been raised in a healthy society where, like you said, self-esteem and happiness is correlated with good relationships with other people, which actually it probably is. I mean, if you believe in anything of evolutionary psychology, we're intrinsically oriented to be pro-group, and we're concerned about the facial expressions of other primates making us feel bad. So all this stuff would be out and about, and it's not the case that we would all sit around and eat as many Doritos as possible and close our doors as tightly as possible. It's not what we are. But they use this argument. They say human nature is to be a maximally selfish, isolationist, antisocial person.
Which is
so you'd have a bunch of monads, and no monad would work. Every monad would sit around by itself. But like my professor used to say, people, when they're bored, spontaneously, I guess you can call it play, but there's going to be some activity aimed towards matter, reconfiguring matter for the sake of use value or fun or sharing or gift giving. Like you said, look what I can do for you. It's just like, it's an instinct.
Yeah, and I'll give a lovely anecdote that came out of an Australian TV show decades ago now, involving some Solomon Islanders, which is an underdeveloped third world country, blah, 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 brought out to Australia for training, and they're filming their experiences in Australia. Well, what the Solomon Islanders, we all came from the same, I think they came from this, they don't think they came from the same village, pardon me, but they all lived in village lives back in the Solomon Islands. And they found themselves walking past people sleeping on the streets in Sydney. And they said, why are they doing that? And the interviewer said, oh, they're homeless. And so, what's homeless? And they then had it explained to them what a homeless person was. And they were simply incredulous. Why haven't you made another home for them then? They were just in shock at the whole concept of somebody being homeless. Because if you're in a village in the Solomon Islands and your hut gets wiped out by a tornado or a tsunami or whatever else, the community gets together and builds the housing again. So these Solomon Islanders, who are supposed to be out to Australia to learn something about Western technology, take back to the Solomon Islanders, actually end up organising a charity to raise money for the homeless in Sydney.
Wow.
So that is more, if you want to say human nature, okay, let's go back to when we hadn't distorted what that nature was by the complex societies we've generated. And it was a cooperative society where you were rewarded for your contribution to the community, which was expected to be done in an altruistic way. With everybody being altruistic, then there was no need for compulsion for work. Hierarchies develop, social structures, et cetera, but it was not at any stretch the sort of lie on a couch do fuck all world we have these days, because people feel so alienated.
Yeah. And in my little science fiction imagination, I would imagine a young entrepreneur walking by and seeing this and thinking, wow, look, they're naturally suckers. They're suckers by nature. How can we exploit the Solomon Islanders? They're willing to do free labor. Come on, let's think of something.
Wait a minute. As an entrepreneur, that's not what we think of, or at least that's not what I think of. But this is a really interesting thing. There's like assumptions, and you say, well, okay, well, what's the entrepreneur thinking of? And Steve, you come from a bit of a different pedigree from an entrepreneur, but I think you'll understand the sentiment here. There's things that an entrepreneur can do, and I think it's kind of like an extension of what Scott was saying. When people have more freedom to do things, right? Essentially, an entrepreneur has the freedom. They're taking the freedom. And now they're assessing it with risk. They're saying, holy shit, if I don't do this, I'm not going to eat, right? But essentially, they're trying to play and provide value and do something in the society that's worth something. I'm not saying there's not bad actors in the system, but I am saying that it's kind of like, for the most part, I don't know. I think there's some pretty good innovations, and the market overall provides a good, more good than evil, right?
Yeah, I mean, innovation certainly is the outstanding strength of capitalism, and we don't want to lose in any society that evolves from capitalism. Given the weaknesses of capitalism, the best way to become wealthy in capitalism is to socialize your losses and privatize your profits. So we've got that side we have to restrain, but the innovation side is the stark contrast with the feudal period and with the socialist states. Innovation by far is the thing that capitalism has as its positive. And the thing is, would a UBI improve that? The answer is quite possibly yes, because if you knew you could try something new, and if you failed, then you'd still have an income. There's a big difference to try something new, and if you fail, you're starved to death. So in that sense, a UBI could be part of enabling people to continue innovating without the risk of wiping out their capacity to stay alive.
And to the east-west distinction that you brought up earlier in production also applies to these little individuals. Yeah,
again,
having a surplus that allows you to experiment or having a surplus is a necessary condition for being able to take risks and do that type of stuff.
Yeah. They've got to be. You see the extreme of people like Elon Musk saying that when he was building what became PayPal, they had one computer. It had run during the day, and he'd code at night. They slept in the office and had their showers at the YMCA, et cetera, et cetera. That is the lengths you've got to go to be innovative without money in a capitalist society. If you had, there's a UBI coming in, you can afford to rent, you can go and get a job if you like, or you can attempt to build your own company. Then maybe we'd see more innovation, not less.
Yeah. And I do have to point out that if we had to roughly go down by 90% of our economy and our output, then we really want to have some sort of incentive. And it sounds weird, but we have to have an incentive to tell people to stay home, to cool their, spending habits, and, really think about, trying to make the products and that they have last longer, stay at home and, not frivolously travel all over the place, right? I mean, there's a whole mentality to it, right? It's a whole game that people have to figure out. I think the market has to actually figure that out. And I envision the biggest position to be hired for or filled by our governments would be to exactly be that, somebody who is a carbon conscious citizen. Here's your salary. And it's your game to try and be as carbon conscious as you can, right? I mean, you got to walk 2 extra miles to not take the bus even. I mean, people do all sorts of interesting things, right? Put it on social media. I don't know. Like, I'd love a society that was like that. What's on news on this week, right? Like, Sally's got, down on a 4-week streak of 0 carbon or something, right? Like, I'm not saying the systemic things have to not change, but it's.
No, that's a good idea. You could have Kim Kardashian walking to the grocery store and then winking at the camera, and suddenly it would be intrinsically valuable to the walk to the grocery store, and you wouldn't have to mention carbon. And I have a cynical remark. So I live next to Whole Foods headquarters, and every week the marketing geniuses are coming up with some new misty-eyed picture of some woman in Africa standing next to a well that was paid for with micro lending, which was helped by Whole Foods. It's just, I'm really cynical about this whole thing because it ends up being advertising. I wonder how much good it does. All these green, like McDonald's, they have a picture of they used to put, like, they had MLK's face on bags for a few years, and of course they made him look like a white person. And then they had lots of trees, and there were green bags there. So all these companies are trying to make themselves look like they're super carbon conscious and pro green just by having 1% of their profit going to they're building wells in Africa, but because they do that, the walls are full of these pictures of little dark-skinned children and women with pregnant women next to wells and stuff, and it looks like, wow, we're in the headquarters of like the most altruistic organism on the planet.
They call it greenwashing for a good reason. Yeah. I mean, what I'll have to see, I think, is huge constraints on the level of production we allow and enable. And as we start going through the impact of climate change and realizing how destructive it is and having to cut back our load on the planet, then we're going to be imposing dramatic controls on what you can produce and how many varieties of goods there are and so on. So I see us falling into a command economy because we've overdone the capitalist one.
Yeah. Well, on that note, that's right at the top of the hour. Steve, you're always punctual, on time, and we appreciate your time. So I think unless anybody else has something else to say, we'll see Steve again next week. Scott, Steve, do you have anything else to say?
That'll do me.
Goodbye.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.